Over the past decade, a cultural revolution based on identity politics and social justice has emerged in the United States and across much of the English-speaking world. Joining me today is Andrew Doyle, a comedian, an author, and also an expert on Renaissance literature, who's written a rather brilliant book about this subject called The New Puritans. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on air to talk about this.
Well, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Now, the phenomenon that we're talking about is sometimes referred to as woke. Sometimes people talk about it using that slightly old-fashioned terminology, political correctness, or political correctness gone mad, as they often say. Sometimes people talk about this phenomenon of identity politics as cultural Marxism. But you in your book are very clear that we should call this critical social justice, a critical social justice movement. Why do you think we should call it that? And what is so specific about it?
Well, we have to call it something. And its practitioners are particularly good at problematizing any terms that are used to describe them. And there's a good strategic reason for that, insofar as it's very difficult to engage with an enemy if you don't know what to call it. And so we've had all sorts of problems. We use the word woke as a shorthand because that's how these people describe themselves up until yesterday. You know, they were very proud to be woke. You know, Jack Dorsey was on stage with a Stay Woke t-shirt. That was back in 2015. People pronounced it. They used it as a term, you know, to suggest that they were awake to injustice. That's where it comes from. I mean, originally it's a word that comes from the sort of Black civil rights movement, and even earlier, the idea of being awake to social injustice, but specifically racism. And then it broadened out in the sort of mid-2010s to mean just generally being awake to all sorts of injustices. And then people embraced it. But then, of course, a few years later, people like me, I suppose, started referring to these people as woke, as a courtesy, really, because they referred to themselves as woke. And then their next strategy was to say, oh, we never described ourselves as woke. Woke was merely a snarl word invented by the right to demonize us. And they did this sort of, as they often do, this revisionist approach where they pretended things that happened that we all saw didn't actually happen. So now the term has come to be mistrusted. And I think one of the reasons it's mistrusted is because it's a very good shorthand. When you say someone is woke, you know exactly what you mean. You don't have to say that these are people who are obsessed with the notion of group identity, and that theirs is a theory derived from the French post-structuralists of the 1960s, and that they believe in these power structures that undergird society, and that you have to be trained in critical theory to detect such power structures, and that we have to reconstruct and revolutionize society according to these beliefs. We just say woke, and all of that is kind of encapsulated within that, which is much quicker and much easier and much more comprehensible. So they call themselves social justice activists, and they're very concerned with social justice. And I think we need to distinguish between what they mean by social justice and what everyone else means by social justice. And I suppose adding that phrase critical social justice is a really good way to allude to the critical theory upon which all of this stuff is based. And the phrase critical social justice was originally used by some of the woke themselves. So again, it's quite a courteous means of describing them. I think they would find it very difficult to suggest that you're being derogatory in any way by doing so. So that's quite a good phrase because, as I say, it distinguishes from the notion of social justice, because this is often another tactic. People will say, well, why would you be opposed to social justice? Why would you sneer at social justice warriors? Do you have anything against social justice? Which, of course, is quite a similar thing to saying, well, why would you have a go at BLM? What, do you think that Black lives don't matter? So rhetorically speaking, these kind of phrases are very good. But of course, this is a movement, as I outline in the book, The New Puritans. This is a movement that relies on the good natures of the public to take at face value the language that they use to describe themselves. It would be a bit like assuming that North Korea is a democratic state because it describes itself as the Democratic Republic of North Korea. So it's a similar kind of thing. If you are a social justice activist, you say you're for social justice, you say you're progressive, but you're actually very regressive. You say that you're liberal, but everything about your movement is illiberal. You say that you're for freedom, but you are actually for censorship. So everything is kind of different to the definitions of the words that we all understand are not quite applicable to the way in which the disciples of this new religion use the terms. And that's right why I say if we call this critical social justice, that distinguishes it from social justice. And it also means they can't come back and say, well, that's just a snarl word, as they do with woke.
Mm.
I think it's just a useful way of doing it. I mean, I don't know if it will catch on. Helen Pluckrose was using this term before I was, and actually reading her book, the book she wrote with James Lindsay, Cynical Theories, persuaded me of the wisdom of doing so.
One of the things that's interesting about your using the term critical social justice is that it kind of alludes to the fact that all of these ideas, woke, political correctness, cultural Marxism, it all basically stems from, and you mentioned this, critical theory. This is sort of the intellectual fountainhead of this whole cultural revolution. Can you talk us through a little bit about what critical theory is, where it came from, why it emerged?
Yeah, I mean, the postmodernists of the 1960s and early 70s were very concerned with the idea of the demolition of grand narratives, and those can be all of the things that we associate with upholding Western civilization. So it could be the church, it could be reason itself, rationality. It could be the idea. I mean, how do they put it? It could even be language itself. I mean, that was a key focus of their movement, was to kind of deconstruct meaning and to suggest that there's no reality beyond the language that we use to describe it. So that they were saying that what we need to do to change society for the better is to deconstruct language and move it around, and etc. And that when they started out, they had these broad ideas that they didn't really, no one ever sort of, people, the likes of Foucault and Derrida were theorizing, Lyotard, you know, people like, they were theorizing, but they weren't saying let's apply these theories to public policy or social policy, whatever it might be. And then around 1989, you got what Helen Pluckrose calls the applied postmodernists. So these were activists masquerading as academics. These were academics saying, no, actually, we do believe all of these untested theories. They at that point saw Foucault as a kind of deity. There was even an awful book by David Halpern called Saint Foucault, Towards a Gay Hagiography. So they weren't hiding it. And they said, let's apply these theories to society. And that's why at the heart of so many of these critical, by critical, you know, the idea of demolition of those grand narratives of what I'm talking about. The idea of applying this stuff to society is so embedded in these practices. So, for instance, you can't be a critical race theorist without believing in what they call praxis, in the idea of applying those theories. And that's why it's not just a group of people at a conference saying, well, you know, we've got to work out why racism still lingers in a society where there are legal protections against it. We've got to work that out. And what we think is that there are these power structures, that there is such thing as white privilege, that black people only succeed in this society if it's in the interest of whites. They call that interest convergence. They believe that society is organized around white people for the benefit of white people. These are all the key premises of critical race theory, but they don't just leave it at that. They don't just leave it at theorizing. They have to apply it. And so in a classroom, you will get children segregated by skin color, as happened at the American school in London, which is, by the way, is the most expensive day school in England. And you had those kids segregated by skin color for after school activities. There was a Channel 4 documentary called The School That Tried to End Racism. What it really meant was the school that applied critical race theory in practice. And they divided classes up by skin color. And the kids were very upset about it. If you watch that documentary, there's a moment where one boy runs out of the room crying because it's not nice, because kids are not naturally racist. Right?
Bizarre that you try and end racism by applying it to the way you structure your school.
Well, I used to be a teacher, so I know a lot of teachers who are having this happen to them. And a teacher friend of mine said to me, you know, he was really distressed because this visiting speaker, and it often is a visiting speaker, came into the school, picked out all the black boys from the class and took them into another room and then lectured them about how they'll always be oppressed by their white peers. And of course, they resented that because they're like, well, why have you left our friends in the other room? And why are you saying our friends are oppressing us? And then the white kids were upset because they're saying, why have you taken our black friends out of the room and made us feel like, you know, there's something different going on, that we're different types of people.
So these ideas sort of bubble up from academia in the 60s and the 70s until quite recently. They're only really applied to, I don't know, sort of critically deconstructing English literature, or, you know, abstractions in the far recesses of academia. What's happened recently, you're saying, is that they've become something that sort of guides the day-to-day political stance of people. I mean, I think you were probably the first person, it may have been an original insight by you, you're certainly the first person that I came across who tried to explain this cultural revolution as almost a sort of secular religious movement. It's a belief system, isn't it?
Yes, I don't think that was original to me. I think a number of people have seen within this religious echoes and cultish. I know Peter Boghossian wrote a piece about the notion of original sin many years ago, comparing it to the idea of white privilege. So I think this is something that has been going on for a long time.
Let's try and tease this out. If you could just slightly riff on this theme of how the critical social justice movement is like a religion. What are some of the parallels?
Yeah, so I mean, well, there's two things you're sort of asking here is about how, how it, I mean, firstly, we should acknowledge what you said there, which is that it originated within my discipline, within the humanities. When I was studying at university in the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s, it was very much the way you approach the text isn't the old style practical criticism. It was deconstructive criticism. In other words, you tease out the contradictions in the text. Effectively, we became like moral detectives. If I wanted a good grade, I would basically try and work out how Shakespeare was homophobic, or how Shakespeare.
Did this person in the past think the way I did? And if not, what a bad person they must have been.
Exactly, and it's surprising how you would be rewarded for making these moral pronouncements of people who are long dead. And it enables very mediocre people to sort of lord it over those who are far superior minds, of course. But anyway, so that was going on. I didn't see it coming. Don't think anyone saw it coming, that this would spread from the humanities into the sciences, for God's sake, but also that it would more than that go out into the real world, beyond the ivory tower of academia, and it has done. So every time a politician talks about white privilege, talks about someone being cisgender, talks about hegemony or cis heteronormativity, or what, they are using the language that I thought was just confined to universities back in the day, and it was for a long time. It was safely being toyed around with by these various academics. But now it is very much mainstream, to the extent that you hear mainstream commentators using this kind of language. So the reason why referring it to a religion is helpful is because, as I said before, because the language that they use to describe themselves is so far removed from what they actually mean. Because they are quite unforgiving, and they seem to punish heresy, and they do see it as heresy. Wrongthink would be the Orwellian phrase of the way you would put it. You see that the way they behave on their playground, Twitter or X as it's now known, or Facebook, or social media generally, is that they see someone express an opinion that is wrongthink, that is heresy, and they pile on and destroy. And they've developed this idea of cancel culture, which is a kind of strategic mass form of boycotting that takes tiny slights and sort of reacts very disproportionately and tries to get people fired, gets their bank accounts taken away from them, to give the example of Nigel Farage. But that's a good example, of course, that where it's gone mainstream. No one was complaining to Coutts about the fact that Nigel Farage had an account with them. This was within the body of the bank. They produced that huge document outlining all of the wrongthink, all of the opinions that they did not like, and they thought they had to punish him for that. That's an extension of cancel culture, which is the strategy of social justice activists. Now, if you see cancel culture as a form of excommunication, then it kind of makes sense of it. If you see all these very, very intelligent people suddenly believing that we all have a kind of gendered soul that may or may not match our anatomy, that doesn't make sense, because you see these people, you think, well, they're incredibly smart. They're some of the smartest people in the world. And yet they do have this belief system. But once you see it as a religion, then it makes sense. Similarly, when you see the bullying, the viciousness, the aggression, the ferocity of these activists online who wish death on people, send death threats and rape threats to J.K. Rowling and all kinds of feminists for daring to question their belief system, and they do so believing that they're on the side of the angels, well, that only makes sense if you think of it in terms of a religion. I quote in the book Steven Weinberg, the American physicist, who made that point, that in a world where you had just good and bad, you would have good people doing good things and bad people doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, that takes religion. I think that's right. If you think about the inquisitors strapping women to the rack, torturing people, burning people at the stake, and doing so thinking that they were holy and on the side of God, that makes sense. That's suddenly comprehensible if you see it in terms of a religion. And so just to finish that point, similarly, they have their kind of foundational holy texts. They have the intersectionality of Kimberly Crenshaw. They have the texts of Michel Foucault. They have Judith Butler, the sort of books like Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter. So they have these foundational texts, and they have their jargon. They have their language. A bit like the church didn't used to want to translate the Bible into the vernacular, and the Mass used to be kept within Latin. So the normal people didn't understand it. All of these things. And similarly with the idea of the trans movement, the idea that you can have an innate soul that is different from the substance. Well, that's pure transubstantiation. You can take out the accidents of something and replace. You can change the substance of something, but it remains. It has the accidents, the quality of that thing that remains. Like the bread becomes the flesh of Christ. It looks like bread and tastes like bread. It has the accidents of bread, but it has the substance of flesh. That's what they're saying in terms of the trans movement. So all of a sudden, calling it a religion is not me saying it is a religion, that there's a deity or that there's what I'm saying is, as soon as you do that, suddenly everyone understands it and everyone understands what you mean. And they also understand how that can be exploited in the way that religions in the past have been exploited. It's a very accessible analogy, I suppose.
One of the things I really like about the book is where you draw comparisons between the critical social justice movement today and Arthur Miller's book, The Crucible, which is a fantastic play. I was required to read The Crucible growing up. It was, for those who don't know, it's a play written by Arthur Miller about a real historic event that happened in New England in the late 17th century when there was an outbreak of witch hunting and several people were killed for supposedly being witches. Miller writes this in, I think, the 1950s as a parable as to what's going on with the so-called anti-communist witch hunt of McCarthyism. And I sort of remember being made to read this play and taught that, this is in the past when people became sort of hysterical, they behaved monstrously, believing they were virtuous, and the Crucible should serve as a warning. Don't behave like 17th century Puritans. And yet you rather magnificently refer to this episode of the Salem witch trials and the Crucible. And you show that there are people who behave like that horrible character, Abigail Williams, who make hysterical mob claims about heretics. You've got figures of authority who should know better, who go along with it all. You've got the occasional hero like that poor farmer, I think his name was Giles Corey, who was being murdered and very bravely said "more weight" as his final words as they were crushing him to death. You bring to life really this sense of how monstrous things are done by people believing they're virtuous, like 17th century Puritanism.
And that's why it's quite useful to call, again, I'm trying to find phrases to describe these activists. So calling them the new Puritans, firstly, it distinguishes them from the Puritans, because the Puritans of old were completely, they didn't know if they were elect or damned. So they had constant doubts about themselves, about their fallibility, that they could be wrong. That's something that the new Puritans do not share. They don't have that sense of their unworthiness before God. In fact, theirs is
they didn't
a
have the
godless
humility. They didn't have the humility and no option of redemption, which the traditional Puritans had.
And it's really important to distinguish and to understand that I'm using the phrase the new Puritans metaphorically, because they are very different from the Puritans of old, and I want to make that absolutely clear. Although it is again, it's a way to describe. We've all seen their behavior is related to this idea of an expectation of moral purity, and that your morality must align precisely with their own. If you deviate slightly, then you are wrong. So this idea of purity spirals and this expectation of purity makes them Puritans in that colloquial sense, and that's quite a good way to describe them. But also, as you say, this human propensity for hysteria that we saw among the residents of late 17th century Massachusetts in Salem and the neighboring towns. And it's a particularly sad story because these people were God-fearing, decent folk who didn't go around hunting witches. There's a bit of a myth about the Puritans that they were inveterate witch hunters, and they absolutely weren't. That sort of thing went on much, much more in Europe, in medieval Europe. That wasn't the case in Salem. This was an aberration, lasted a little over a year. I think it was February, 1692 to around April, May 1693. So not very long at all. And within that period, 20 people executed, further 5 died in prison, countless people accused, decent, innocent people. But it bears comparison with our current situation, because I like to see the girls who are screaming and crying witch and pointing at their neighbors and accusing everyone of hidden sins, I suppose, things that only they can see. And that's like these activists who they are the ones who can see the sin. They see you as racist. They will brand you as a witch, but the phrases they will use instead of witch are TERF or fascist or Nazi or racist or homophobe or transphobe. And the accusation is sufficient to be taken as proof. And that was similarly the case. And I make this very clear point about how all of those people in the courts who were convicted of witchcraft and died, they were convicted on the basis of what they called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence is what we call lived experience. Lived experience is the phrase that activists always say. They will say, I know this person is racist. And you will say, well, what's your evidence? Well, it's my lived experience.
When someone's being vilified by the mob, facts are discounted.
The girls would say, we see this person with the devil. I can see this black shadow tapping this person on the shoulder. Or I can see this person sending their spirit out as a yellow bird flying up. I can see this person sending their spirit out and pinching me. And now I'm screaming because it's hurting. And that's my lived experience. And that's how they were convicted. Similarly, as I say in the book, the figures of authority, the magistrates and the ministers went along with it. I happen to think it was largely out of fear that they would be the next to be accused, which is what happened to anyone who raised any kind of alarm bells or skepticism about what the girls were doing. I think that was going on. And I think that's similar today. I think if all these screaming activists, who are a minority, every study tells us they are, as they scream and point and shout witch or turf or racist or Nazi or whatever it is they do, if all the figures of authority just said, okay, you can scream and shout, free speech, but we're not going to do anything about it, they would stop, they would go away, which is what happened with the girls in the end in Salem. But they don't do that. What they do is they, like with the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and the SNP and now Sinn Féin, they apply these policies and punish people for wrongthink, as is happening in Southern Ireland as well, and in Scotland with their hate crime bills. They're saying, if you don't go along with what the witches, with what the screaming girls tell us is true, then you are one of the witches, and we will punish you. It's very, very similar.
Every society throughout history has produced its Abigail Williams. It's young people who will be mistaken and naive, and sometimes make malicious complaints. And the really critical point, and I think you make this rather magnificently in your book, is that in the instance of the Crucible, it was authority figures who took seriously things they shouldn't take seriously. And you read that and you think, how on earth could authority figures be so ridiculous? But then you look at what's happening on university campuses today. You look at what's happening in corporate America and corporate Britain today.
Right.
Authority figures are going along with the Abigail Williamses. That's the problem. Why
is Coca-Cola inviting Robin DiAngelo in to berate their white members of staff for being white? Why does the leader of the Labour Party have trouble defining what a woman is, or only discovered what a woman was 2 weeks ago? You know, these things only. Why are Ireland and Scotland introducing the most draconian legislation against free speech that we've seen for a long, long time? And it can only be that they are capitulating with this ideological movement, that they are in a sense captured. Our civil service here is completely captured by this movement, which means that whoever we vote into government, we're still going to get this. Yeah. We're still going to end up with it. Remember that the Tories have presided over all of this, all of the worst excesses. I'm not saying Labour are going to be any better. I think they'll be worse. But the truth is, this is a non-partisan movement. This isn't about left and right. That is a huge misunderstanding.
I mean, the administrative state in America too, it doesn't sometimes matter who you vote for, you end up with the administrative state in charge. Yeah.
You mentioned Abigail Williams. I mean, she was the first girl to cry witch, her and another girl, Betty Parris, who was related to the Reverend Parris in Salem. And it went from there. And similarly, we have, there's a really good book called The Secret of Brynaston, which is by Richard Webster, about the sex scandal, the care home sex abuse scandal of the 1980s in Wales. And that book shows very clearly that a lot of this was down to one fantasist, one woman who went along to these various people when they'd grown up and said, I know you were abused. Other people have said so. This is why, planted this stuff in their heads. And then they started to believe that they had been abused. And there are people in prison today who are doubtless innocent from those witch hunts. It will be the same when it finally explodes. It'll be the same as the satanic sex abuse scandals of the 1980s in America, where social workers were taking children away from their innocent families because they suddenly believed in this myth of satanic pedophilic cults. So the problem is, it doesn't take many, I suppose, is what I'm saying. You just need an Abigail Williams. You just need a Robin DiAngelo. You just need someone in society who is either compelling enough or scary enough for it to sort of latch on. And because we have a natural propensity, I feel, to get caught up in hysteria, it's going to happen, and it has happened.
Here's a really interesting thought. You quite rightly alluded to the fact earlier that progressives call themselves progressive, but are actually trying to do something incredibly regressive. There was this moment, I would say it was the critical moment in Western civilization and indeed in human history, the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, in the West and indeed throughout the rest of the world, people were governed by superstition, by custom, by the hereditary principle. Then, I mean, I'm simplifying slightly, but then you have the Enlightenment, and suddenly you have supposedly reason and rationalism and eventually meritocracy, or steps towards greater meritocracy. And the key moment, I think, in the Enlightenment was an understanding that we today don't know everything that there is to know, and that knowledge is a process of collective discovery. And the reason why that's so important is because if you believe that you know everything there is to know, whether it's in a holy book or a religious book, or because you are woke, you alone understand how the world truly works. It's very dangerous. If you have the humility that comes with this idea that you don't know everything, you know, you're humble. You don't have this sort of narcissistic belief that you know everything there is to know. In a sense, the progressive movement today is taking us right back to that pre-Enlightenment idea, isn't it? This idea that a small group of people know everything, and that anyone who disagrees with that is a heretic, and that, like in the pre-Enlightenment times, we should be judged on the basis of what we're born, our sort of immutable characteristics, rather than who we want to be as individuals.
I mean, explicitly so, because many of the activists have problematized the very notion of the Enlightenment as being a movement of dead white straight men who were acting in the interests of upholding power within society along the basis of group identity, which is how they see absolutely everything. So absolutely that's the case. And they believe that they themselves are woken up to these issues. They know everything, lack of humility, exactly what you say. And that's particularly, I suppose, why they attack the past. And the arrogance of it is quite astounding. You know, this is why they want to topple the statue of Cecil Rhodes at Oriel College in Oxford, or topple statues more generally, not just Rhodes, not just Colston or slave traders, but Mahatma Gandhi, for God's sake, or even Thomas
Jefferson. They want to,
well, yeah, even slavery abolitionists like Lincoln, you know, they and Huxley, like they judge the past so severely. They have this view of the world, of human history, that throughout human history we've always got it wrong, and we've always been just evil, racist scumbags, and then all of a sudden, overnight, they've got the answers. They've got all the answers, and they're going to apply it to society.
It's that line of thinking that leads to literally the creation of Year Zero. I mean, Pol Pot, the Jacobins, they had exactly that conceit, that everyone before them was wrong and we needed to start again. They knew the answer to everything, so literally they created Year Zero, and the implications of that were horrifically murderous.
Well, you make a very good point, and that's why this is a Year Zero. What they want is a cultural revolution. They want to start from scratch, and if that means burning things to scratch and you know, destroying absolutely everything, then so be it. But you've got to ask the question why that is, and I wonder whether anyone who believes that this hasn't happened before can't see the parallels with authoritarian regimes in the past. That can only be that they don't really know about history. I wonder whether all of this is connected to poor education. You know, the activists, they don't really know a lot about what happened in the past, or from my experience anyway. So, you know, even the way that these things are taught on university campus now, the past is problematized. It's merely a realm that we can preside over morally and get brownie points for doing so, rather than trying to engage in the fact that times change, people change, societies change. They don't really engage with any of this.
I want to get on in a bit to talk about what we can actually do to counter this cultural revolution, this dangerous, almost virus-like ideology. But before I do, there's another thing that comes to mind. Reasoning with one of these critical social justice warriors it becomes a sort of circular argument. If like they do, you see every human interaction as based on power, and power relationships as behind everything, it becomes rather meaningless, because anything you claim or invoke, they will simply say, oh yes, that happened because those people were powerful and they were trying to impose their you get underrepresentation of African Americans in the United States for many years, and they say, oh, this is evidence of systematic discrimination and oppression. Then you get, America produces its first African American descended president. Rather than cheering, they say, well, you see that the white supremacist society is cunningly using this individual for its own ends. You can't really win with that kind of logic, can you?
Well, there isn't logic. That's the point. It's faith. It's faith. I mean, so a very good example of this would be the Commission into racial and ethnic disparities in UK education, and this was slammed because it pointed out that the UK education system is not systemically racist. There is no evidence of systemic racism. The Runnymede Trust, which is a body that used to be quite sensible but is now being completely ideologically captured, wrote a report countering everything, and all they had was, we think you're wrong. And the fact that they were denying systemic racism is evidence of systemic racism. As the report pointed out, you can't just say that the educational system is inherently racist because Black Caribbean students don't do as well as white students, because Black students from African origin do better than white students. If that is systemic racism, it's of a very weirdly targeted kind. But when you present these facts, they will be dismissed and just danced around in this weird, endless game. Similarly, try and get into any conversation with one of these gender ideologues about J.K. Rowling. As soon as you ask the question, what has J.K. Rowling said that is transphobic? Please quote something she has said. They never can. Not only can they never do that, all they can do is link you to bad faith articles, misinterpretations of her words, or they just
She once tweeted something that was tweeted by someone who said something that was disagreeable.
Yeah, she wants to tweet someone who tweeted something else, and the very fact that they can't provide. No, look, if I make a claim and someone says provide evidence and I can't, I will always revise that claim. I will say, okay, well, that was based on something that was my own prejudice or something. The fact that they can't do that, and worse still, the very fact that you're asking questions, they take as further evidence of their claims. So an example I give in the book is when the activist Shola Moshogbamimu was on, I think it was Good Morning TV or Good Morning Britain, one of those shows. And she was talking about the systemic racism of the British press and how they were racist against Meghan Markle. Philip Schofield, I think it was, said to her, so what evidence do you have that this was all based on racism? And she said, the fact that you're asking that question is evidence of what I'm talking about. In other words, to even question the premises of these activists bolsters their point, because you wouldn't question it unless you were attempting to, I suppose, shore up your own privilege and your own oppressive status.
Perhaps part of the problem is someone can get away with saying things like that because they've not been ridiculed for the absurdity of taking that sort of position.
Well, that's because to go back to Salem, if you ridiculed the girls, I think it was Martha Corey who laughed at them in court and ended up accused for being a witch. Similarly, who else was that? Well, Frances Nurse was another one who questioned them, and they said, yeah, well, she's in league with the devil. That's why she's questioning us. And then she hanged. So again, we are back to that situation. Anyone who mocks them is attacked. Anyone who questions them, challenges them, presents arguments that defeat them, they will say, well, they're doing that because they are racist, evil Nazis who want the world to stay as it is. So it's that Kafka trap. I mean, the whole premise of Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, is that all white people are racist. And if they deny that they are racist, that is evidence of their racism. That is a Kafka trap. That's how you catch a witch. Yeah. If she denies she's a witch, that proves that she's a witch.
She's a witch, yeah.
So, and now this is all very much counter-enlightenment, isn't it? You can't really have a discussion. I mean, you were alluding to it before, like, what do we do with these people? You can't really have a discussion with someone who's not willing to play by the same rules. Yeah. You can't have an argument or a debate with someone who believes that the very notion of debate is a means to uphold cis white heteronormative privilege, right? So my theory, my belief at the moment is that actually we just need to work around these people. You can't really debate someone who is that illiberal.
They can't be reasoned with.
They cannot be reasoned with. And so most people can. So what you can do is you can work around the activists.
So you've got your sort of irreconcilable activists, and their whole shtick is to make these complaints and articulate these views because presumably it earns some of them a good living.
Yeah.
You've also got, I think, online your sort of simple narcissists. They revel in this idea that they have a purity that the rest of us lack, and that they can somehow judge the rest of us. But I wonder if there's also a sort of what you might call a sort of utilitarian wokey. You might be a pretty mediocre bank CEO. You might be a pretty mediocre advertising executive. You might be a pretty lazy academic. But by wearing this intellectual outfit, you can appear like you're a cutting edge CEO, or you can appear that you as an advertising guru know what you're doing. You can.
I'm sure there's a lot of that. I'm sure there's a lot of cynicism. You know, it is a very cynical approach, that, isn't it? I mean, if you take, for instance, Halifax, the Halifax Building Society, getting their staff to wear pronouns on their badges. Now, no one asked for that. Staff members didn't particularly want it. The public certainly don't want it, but it doesn't cost you anything. And if you do that, you suddenly seem like you're virtuous and with the times, and they see all this on social media and they think that they are. Yeah, I have no doubt that is
your non-executive who chairs the committee on inclusivity and diversity can waffle on at the next board meeting about how they're pushing that agenda forward and all the rest of it.
Yeah, you just invite one of these speakers in. They cost a bit of a fortune by our standards, but not by a corporation standard. It's very cheap for them, actually. I mean, even if you're paying someone like Robin DiAngelo 12 grand an hour or whatever it is she's doing, in the grand scheme of things, for a multi-billion-dollar corporation, that's still quite cheap. And you get that person in, and it does make you look, you've certainly ticked that box. It's like, I'm doing everything to promote diversity and equality, or equity, as they say. So on that, there is a cynical element to it. I think you could say that there are the narcissists, as you say, and there are also the true believers, and then there are the cynics. I think in addition to that, I would add another category, which I think is the bullies. I think there is something about fundamentalist religious movements that will always attract those who are effectively sadists, people who really enjoy inflicting pain on others. And this gives them a kind of psychopaths. I think so. When I was talking to Jordan Peterson recently, he said that there was a proven correlation between sociopathy and members of the social justice movement. And it doesn't surprise me at all. Not just simply experientially, when I see them online and they behave in a way that implies that they don't have any sense of human empathy or basic human compassion. That aside, because that might just be my reading of it, the truth is that if you are doing things, and as I said with the Inquisition, if you are behaving this abysmal, abhorrent way, but saying that you're doing so because you're the good guy, then you can get away with all sorts of things. And so whilst I don't think that most people within the movement fall into that category, I think it will doubtless attract those kinds of people. I mean, look, where else can you send rape threats, explicit threatening pornographic imagery to a woman like J.K. Rowling, as they do online, say that you're going to beat her up with a hammer, say that TERFs, women should be decapitated, even go so far as to actually inflict violence on women, as happened at the Let Women Speak event in Melbourne or New Zealand, and still say you're the good guy, right? Where else can that happen? And I've seen there's a lot, when it comes to extreme trans activists, that the rhetoric a lot of them use is extremely violent. It's about hurting, punishing, killing, murdering TERFs. That phrase, decapitate TERFs, was on a placard at one of the protests in Scotland. Unfortunately, 2 SNP councillors were standing right in front of it, and they didn't seem to notice this, or if they did, they didn't care. You get a lot of the stickers and the posters that the trans activists put up have pictures of people with guns, shooting guns at saying "shut the fuck up, TERF," with a gun pointing. That kind of language, that kind of rhetoric, is very deeply embedded within the movement, and that implies to me, or suggests to me, that especially within the sort of autogynephile community, those the sort of men who get sexually aroused by thinking of themselves as women, there is a deep misogyny within that, and that the idea of inflicting violence on women is also a turn on. And so all of this stuff is sort of happening within that movement. But where else would it happen? And the likes of Owen Jones would come out cheerleading for those bullies. Right? That's interesting to me, that here there is cover for some genuinely unpleasant people. If I was a bullying sociopath, I'd join that movement in a heartbeat. I can do all of this stuff, and people will say, and the government will say that I'm doing wonderful work, and politicians.
And you believe you're genuinely on the side of righteousness.
Well, even if you don't, even if you're doing it, I think some of them do, but like I say, I think there are some who don't. The example I've given before is someone like, if you recall, you remember the Shankill Butchers, that group of murderers during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Belfast-based run by that guy Murphy, although that's a Catholic name, was not a Catholic. He was a Protestant who where his grave says, "Here lies a soldier." That man is a serial killer on a par with Jack the Ripper. He didn't just murder people, he kidnapped them, tortured them in the most grotesque, gruesome way.
And enjoyed it.
And enjoyed it. So he was a psychopath, without a doubt. But suddenly he could be in a movement where he was lauded, where people were saying, you're doing something really good. You're defending our country. And they bury him with that, "Here lies a soldier." He's not a soldier. He's a psychopathic serial killer. Where else could someone like that find that kind of cover? You know, where? And I think there's a similarity.
So this cultural revolution is driven by a handful of the true believers, by opportunists, by sociopaths, and by an agglomeration of people. But one thing you say in your book, and I think it's really important to develop this point, you say that it's not widely a belief system of the young. And sometimes older people make the mistake of assuming that all young people believe in these ideas. Actually, it's a minority amongst the young as well.
It's really interesting to see the dividing lines now. I mean, the study that I saw last week was suggesting that conservative viewpoints are very much on the rise among young men and dominate among young men, whereas the more left-leaning perspectives dominate among young women. But as I've said before, I think in terms of the culture war, we shouldn't think in terms of left and right. We should think in terms of liberalism, or being liberal or being anti-liberal.
For an American audience, I'm always slightly loath to use the term liberal, because weirdly and rather inconveniently, the term liberal amongst many of our audience is regarded as synonymous with progressive. But by liberal, you mean free thinking, classical, open.
Classical liberalism, liberal values, as if you read John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, the idea of individual autonomy, but with an acknowledgement of our shared humanity, the idea of freedom of speech,
the values of the founding fathers.
Right. That you can do whatever you want with your life without interference from the state, so long as you don't encroach on the values of other people. Now, that's something, that's what I mean by liberalism, liberal values. And I think those are shared by people on the right and the left. I don't think that it's not specific to right or left-leaning thinking, right? It's complicated because in the UK, we mean liberal. When we say liberal, we mean classical liberalism. In America, when they say liberal, they mean left-leaning. It's further complicated by the fact that the Liberal Party in Australia is a conservative party. So it's not, I understand why you are reticent about that word. And I do want to avoid the kind of left-right debate, because I just don't think it has anything remotely to do with the culture war, really. I think it's been widely misunderstood as that. John Stuart Mill's book on liberty opens with this idea of the struggle between liberty and authority. In other words, are you the sort of person who wants to be able to do whatever you want with your life so long as you don't hurt others? Or are you the sort of person that wants to defer to the pronouncements of an authority figure? That's the conflict, and that's what the culture war really is about. So I've gone off on a digression on liberalism, but you were asking specifically a question before I got to that. What was that?
I mean, I think I was building up to the idea of what is it that we can do about this? What is it that, I mean, part of the answer, I think, is to recognize it for what it is, as a sort of secular religious fundamentalism.
You were asking about the young.
Yeah.
And I should make that point before I forget. The studies have shown, there's a study by the More in Common initiative, which found that in the UK, at least, what we would describe as the woke people, or critical social justice advocates, constitute roughly 13% of the population, which means they are a minority in all age groups. Even, there was a horrific study last week by Newsweek, I think it was, which found that roughly 40% of people between the age of 28 and 35 believe that misgendering ought to be criminally prosecuted. So if I describe a biological male who identifies as female as he, then I should go to prison for that. That's a very, very disturbing study by a reputable source. But although even there, you note it's not the majority. So it's a large minority, larger than I would like it to be. In 1917, the Bolsheviks were a tiny minority in Moscow. I mean, it's the inertia of the 85% that is the problem, I think. That's it. You don't go back to Salem. It was a minority of the villagers in Salem who were crying witch. You only need a few. Any corporation gets captured by critical social justice if it has one or two really vocal cheerleaders within its ranks. So we've seen the civil service turned, the NHS has turned, the British Army, the MOD, the police, certainly universities, although in universities they're a majority, I think. But do you see what I mean? That You don't need many to curdle the waters. And I think that, so this idea of thinking it's just a battle between the old and the young is completely wrong. And the pushback from the young has been quite heartening, I think, although some of them take it too far because they're young. And so they go into the kind of alt-right territory as a way to sort of attack the woke. And that's not the way to do
it. This is kind of what bothers me. I'm talking to you from the United States of America, and I think I'm right in saying that most people I talk to in America don't primarily categorize themselves on the basis of their ethnicity. Most white people in America, I think, just tend to see themselves as being American. What I fear is that if we go down this path of, a kind of critical race theory plus a backlash to it, we will give people a kind of an identity that they don't currently have that will further fragment the country. The United States is based on this idea that all of us are created equal. That's not to say the same outcomes, but we're all equal under the law.
Yeah.
If you start to look at every example of inequality, unequal educational attainment, unequal socioeconomic outcomes, unequal propensity towards criminality and violence, and if you start to explain that as the critical justice movement does in terms of systemic discrimination, you are provoking someone to come along and say, actually, maybe those differences reflect differences of behavior predicated on things like time preferences. And then I think you start to enter very dangerous territory indeed.
Yes, if you're going to promote the idea that the whole world needs to be understood only through the idea of group identity, then you're not going to be surprised if there have been groups in history that promoted their group identity over others in very unpleasant ways, right? And so you're going to get that kind of backlash. You can't have it both ways. Similarly, if you promote the idea of political violence, if you try and excuse the idea of rioting, looting shops, and even shooting people during the BLM riots of summer 2020, then, other people are going to take that trick. Other people are going to riot and kill.
You've got to be as critical of January the 6th as you were of the BLM. They're both riots and they're both wrong.
You have to be consistent. And that's the consistency is really, really important. And people really fail to do that because so many people do everything along tribal lines at the moment, and like Hannah Arendt pointed out in her book on violence, which I think was around 1970, she talks about this idea that once you advocate for violence and once you excuse it, the trouble with a violent political activity is you don't know where the ends are. You can't control where violence goes. You can't predict the outcome and the spirals of violence.
It takes on a life of its own.
It absolutely does. And we've seen that again and again. And similarly, if you espouse authoritarian ideas, if you say it's perfectly fine to delete the bank accounts of my political opponents, I'm safe because I don't think the way they think, then for goodness sake, what's going to happen when the banks are in the hands of other people who don't think the same way as you? I mean, this happens again and again, this kind of myopic inability to have any sense of what's coming around the corner. If you take, for instance, the after the Cable Street confrontations, where it was the Labour government that were pushing for more draconian public order acts, a way in which to prevent fascists from gathering. But all of that legislation was ultimately used against left-wing people, the trade unions during the Thatcher era, because you've planted the seed. You've said it's absolutely fine for the state to prevent freedom of speech and freedom of association, but you give them those powers. You can't control the way those powers are ultimately used. And that's why I think liberalism in the traditional meaning of the word is the most appropriate way, because it defends all of our freedoms. It says, it's like with the marches in Skokie when the neo-Nazis were marching in Skokie in Chicago, and the ACLU came out and defended them, even though, and there's a book called Defending My Enemy by a guy called Naya, who's a Jewish writer, was major prominent figure in the ACLU. And he wrote this book saying, the reason I'm defending the neo-Nazis and their right to free speech is because I hate them and everything they stand for. And I want to be able to defeat them in the marketplace of ideas, not to make martyrs of these people, but furthermore, not to deprive them of free speech, because I don't know, once that precedent is set, whether that will be used against me and against everyone else. And that's the way the ACLU is now completely lost and is being captured by ideology. And as I've said many times, once any institution or any body is captured by this ideology, it ceases to function in its traditional way. Its only function then is to promote the ideology, which is what universities do now instead of teaching people things, right? So no, I think it's really dangerous. I think having the sort of being so short-sighted that you promote violence and authoritarianism because those with the cultural clout happen to be in your camp at the moment is just incredibly short-sighted and betrays a lack of understanding of history.
Now, your book, The New Puritans, I think is the I think it's actually, I'm not just saying this because you're on this show. I think it's the best deconstruction, if I can use that word, of what's going on, of the movement. Just to finish on a positive note, I mean, what signs can we turn this around? What can we do about it? You mentioned the education system is fairly critical. What can we do about it? And what causes of optimism do you think there are? Do you think there's going to become a time in 20, 30 years where we look back and think, what on earth were we thinking? How on earth did we allow FTSE 100 and companies to be run by people who are so vacuous? How did we allow our public universities to be taken over by these lunatics? Well, what did it take to get that?
Well, I don't know. I'm no Mother Shipton or Nostradamus, but there are two potential futures, I suppose. The one in which the woke win, in which case we're heading for an authoritarian world, or the way that I think we'll go, which is that I think in about 40, 50 years' time, people will look back and think, wow, do you remember that spate of absolute madness? It'll be like the Salem witch trials. Can you believe everyone, by the way, after Salem repented of it? Everyone involved in it.
And rather like the COVID lockdowns, no one will remember supporting it.
Right, exactly. I think what that will happen. I mean, more and more in England, I'm seeing prominent voices coming out and saying against the kind of the gender ideologues. How did we get to the point where we have an NHS-funded clinic that is putting children, predominantly gay and autistic children, onto life-changing drugs and irreversible surgery?
And mutilating them. It's a form of child sacrifice for this religion.
Mutilating children, healthy teenage girls getting double mastectomies. I mean, this is not something in the middle of it, in the eye of this storm. To some people, it looks reasonable, even moral.
Those physicians responsible for the mutilation of children in pursuit of this ideology, they really do need to be made to answer for this. I mean, it's evil. Absolutely. It's just evil.
Pure evil. And yet it's perpetrated by good people sometimes. I do believe that. I think that sounds ridiculous, but I think it can be the case. And I think they're going to... But the problem is, once you've been one of those parents, say, who have consented to the mutilation of your child, as Helen Joyce pointed out in a recent interview, you can't go back on that. You can't say I was wrong, because you would have to admit to mutilating your child.
The truth is too awful to accept.
Psychologically, it would be impossible for any individual to accept the horror of the thing that they've done. However, because I'm seeing more and more people speak out against it, I mean, look, there's been such risk to speaking out, certainly in the arts and in the media. You would, if you're an actor who said something about this, you wouldn't be employed again. You wouldn't get a role.
I know some actors who have challenged woke in different ways and are unemployable as a direct result. I mean, they pay a horrific price for it.
No, I've spoken to an actor recently, because now most rehearsal processes start with people announcing their pronouns, and she refuses to do it. She just doesn't get work. And this is just the way it is in that industry. So most people are going to be silent because most people have to get on with the business of living. But for those of us who are in a position where we can say what we want, I consider myself very privileged in that respect, is that I've always been able to say what I want because my job depends on me speaking honestly. And but if I was still a teacher working at a school, I would have been fired, actually, I think, because I would have been very outspoken. This is not something I can be quiet about, just from my own conscience. I couldn't live with myself if I was silent about this stuff. But I also recognize that a lot of people are silent about it out of pure necessity, because if you're one pay packet away from poverty, those are really high stakes. So it's not that I don't have sympathy for people who are being quiet about this, but the truth is, the majority of people do understand the problems here. And I'm seeing the tipping point will come when it becomes acceptable to speak out, and all of a sudden you'll see it cascade, and most people will be speaking out about it. And worse than that, I suppose, all of us who were speaking out early on will be forgotten, I think. But I think it will be like, this was never a problem. We went through a moment of madness, and a lot of people have risked a lot and lost a lot. And I think and I hope that those people are recognized. I'm thinking like people like Graham Linehan, the writer of Father Ted, one of the best comedic writers that we have, who cannot get work, even though he is one of the best. He's completely vilified, completely attacked, completely cancelled. If you believe cancel culture doesn't exist, just look at his example.
And probably, unlike J.K. Rowling, not wealthy enough to be able to be immune to the consequences of that cancellation.
Yeah, but then similarly with J.K. Rowling, you know, she didn't have to say this stuff. And constant death and rape threats aren't nice, even if you are a millionaire. You know, I think.
I'm going to say this, but I think you actually deserve recognition for being so courageous. You've not just written a brilliant book, but you've kind of made a career out of through comedy and through satire, I would say, rather than parody, through satire, in exposing some of this. And when that moment comes, when we all turn and look back and say, how on earth did we end up believing these insane things? I think you will be one of those people who helped get us out of the mess. I think what you're doing is phenomenal.
That's a very kind thing to say, but I wonder, you know, if I look back at I wrote 2 books as this character, Titania McGrath, who is a sort of my satirical take on a social justice activist. But you know, if you look back at the first book, which was I think published in 2019, the stuff they're saying now is even more absurd than what she's saying, but they're saying it for real. And I wonder whether, you know, if you look at that book in 30 years time, 40 years time, when we've gone back to normality, it just won't make sense, right? Because you'll be like, well, no one would ever say that. No one would, but they did for a while. But yeah, I mean, particularly coming from the comedy community, I mean, that's the reason I did it. I was getting so frustrated by the fact that comedians were preventing other comedians from joking about this stuff because they would them for it.
I think Titania, your alter ego, was one of the first people I knew who got banned on social media because her mockery of these child mutilators and other things was deemed to be so offensive by the liberal tech elites in San Francisco that you were actually taken off air for a while.
Yeah, I was. It was a weird time. I mean, you know, I rarely tweet at her now. I only do it if because I've done all that, you know. So I do it every now and then if something really bothers me, but I rarely do. I still write a column as her for the Critic magazine because there's stuff still happening, and in some quarters it is getting worse. So I do think mockery and satire is still one of the ways in which we can combat this. I think it is important.
Maybe Titania will be regarded as a heretic by the movement because she's not mad enough for them now.
Yeah, not enough. Exactly. So I don't know. I am sort of optimistic. Well, I have good days and bad days. You know, I think ultimately we have to win this one because it's too nonsensical. You know, when the progressives are mutilating children, now at that point, I think that will be the turning point as well. By the way, I think coming after people's kids, that's going to be the end of it, right?
I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. I mean, I run a think tank. Since leaving elected politics in Britain, I've been very involved in the think tank world. Now, traditionally, think tanks have been advocating for a free society by talking about taxes and labor market deregulation and all these other really important things. But I think actually it's what you're talking about that is really the big battle. All those other things are basically a sideshow. We need to win this battle against this extremist belief system, because if we don't, none of those other things matter. If we concede this, the whole notion of individualism, the whole notion of us as each being free agents in charge of our own futures, all that goes out the window. And, you know, I think, you know, if you don't stop this stuff today, it will radicalize to a form where it really will lead to a kind of year zero type tyranny. It really will. It's not a figure of speech. You really will end up with people insisting on us renaming ourselves and our months, and you know, it really will be a Jacobin type takeover.
I think we underestimate if we don't have higher education, if we don't have universities that are committed to the production of knowledge and truth and education for its own sake, if we just have madrasas, ideological factories instead, look, it took about 4 decades for this stuff, which was percolating in higher education, to make its impact on society. But when it did, boy, I mean, it really did. Where will we be in another 40 years if we don't solve that problem, right? They are so embedded in universities. I think the future will be building new institutions. It will be things like the University of Austin at Texas. It will be things like Ralston College in Savannah. It will be actually
the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, I think.
Well, there we go. There's another one, right? So no, but building new things. Also, there's a lust for it. You know, like young people want a classical education because it's the best education. You know, they don't want to be spoon-fed queer theory, critical race theory, intersectionality, Foucault, etc. Because they want to. Most young people want to learn how to think and to encounter new ideas and different ideas. They don't want to just become automaton, you know. And I like to think that when these new institutions crop up and prove to be so popular, that will be the way out of this. I think probably it's about education, and not just higher education, but also education full stop. I think schools need to stop pandering to this stuff, but particularly primary school, that with the young kids. No young child ought to be taught that they have a gendered soul, or that there are multiple types of gendered souls, and that these can be misaligned with the body. I mean, this is no more than they should be taught to believe that animal sacrifice is important to appease the goddess of the night, or whatever, you know, whatever. Let's not impose extreme belief systems as though they were fact on young people. And if we do, I think you're right, we could have a nightmare future ahead of us. But I think sufficient numbers of people now are recognizing that this is a problem and are being courageous enough to speak out. And that to me is great. What I want is for the book that you've read, The New Puritans, I want my book to be completely obsolete. And I've said that in the book. I want that book to make no sense to future readers. I want them to read that and think that couldn't have happened. But that's also, by the way, why I've been so careful with sourcing everything. If you look at the footnotes in that book, I've been very diligent in terms of just giving evidence for everything I say and giving examples, because I just don't think in the future people are going to believe it.
Oh, any chance of you coming over to this side of the Atlantic to talk about it? Have you got any gigs lined up?
I would love to. I mean, I am coming over. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago for a show.
Wonderful.
I'm coming over to Florida very soon.
Wonderful.
I'd love to do, talks. I'd love to come out there and give talks and
wonderful. Well, if we could maybe following up from this, if you could do a short detour to Jackson, Mississippi, we would love to host you. We had Douglas Murray here quite recently, and we had Betsy DeVos, and so we've had some great speakers. We would love to add you to the list if we can.
I would love to. I'm a big fan of America. I always really enjoy it when I'm there. So and I think this is something that, whereas I think we're making real headway in the UK in terms of the gender issue, I think the US has a long way to go on that one. It's really stuck.
Well, you might actually, it might be the hook on which to sort of hang your trip, because we've just started to deliberately look at what the UK's done and what certain Scandinavian countries have done, and what I think the Netherlands has done in terms of taking on some of the child mutilation that was being done in the name of this religion. And we started to introduce similar legislation here at a state level. So actually, you're right. This is a very hot button issue in the United States, but I think particularly the southern states are starting to come out of it right. So I think if you could talk to that, I think you would find a very, very receptive audience.
Well, yeah, and I mean, also, I see in America a lot of the problems as well is that the because of the excesses of the, I won't even say LGBTQIA plus movement, it's just the TQI plus bit, who have really kind of they're almost kind of radicalizing people against gay people. I've seen sort of some very aggressive homophobia coming out of sort of elements of the right in America, because they tie all this together.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it's not gay people who are sending drag queens into schools to twerk in front of 4-year-olds.
So you think the original campaign for equal treatment under the law for gay people, which famously I think in California in the 1960s there was a big movement for, you're saying that's getting reversed almost, because people are looking at the kind of outrageous behavior of some of the transgender activists. And
I have no doubt. I have no doubt, because of this force teaming, because of this alphabet soup, LGBTQIA plus means absolutely nothing. Sexual orientation has absolutely nothing to do with this belief system of gender identity, and yet they're tagged together in this move. It makes no sense. In fact, one is hostile to the other.
This is what's so worrying. I mean, this idea of a backlash. The problem with backlashes are they tend to be wild, and you don't know which direction they'll go. That's what's so worrying.
Yeah, exactly. So that is another worry. So I would be happy to talk about all of this and anything else you want me to talk about within my field of expertise.
Andrew, it has been a privilege to have you join us. I'm sorry I went on slightly longer than we expected, but there's so much that I could talk to you about. You have so many fascinating things to say. Please carry on saying them, and